Charlie Rose.
The debate over the debt has begun. In fact, there's been much debate about the proposal released last week by Erskine Bowles and Alan Simpson, the co-chairman of the Bipartisan Deficit Commission. They have been credited for starting a serious national conversation about the challenge. They've also been criticized by some on the left for overlooking the interest of the middle and working class. Joining me now, two people who have argued that view. From Chicago, Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky. She is a member of the commission. She released her own plan this week that favors deep cuts at the Pentagon and higher taxes on corporations and the wealthy. From Washington, Dean Baker, co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research, he has argued the co-chairs should be complaining that the deficit is too small rather than too large, given the economic crisis. After having Bowles and Simpson on our program, I'm pleased to have Baker and Congresswoman Schakowsky here to talk about a different look at where we are and where we ought to go. I begin with you because we took note of what you had said in your proposal. Tell me what you think of what Bowles and Simpson said and what you are now saying.
Well, I'm saying a number of things that are quite different. One, I think that we need to continue to help the economy grow for the next few years. The Simpson-Bowles proposal begins to make cuts right away and doesn't put any money right away into investments, which are actually deficit reducers because it puts more people to work when we invest in the economy. And secondly, I come from a very different philosophy at this problem, which is that the middle class and lower income people have already sacrificed, had nothing to do with creating the deficit, and therefore that the solutions that cut further into the middle class, which has seen no increase in their wealth over the last practically 2 decades, that we ought to get the money and reduce the deficit from things like raising revenue, mainly on the wealthier Americans. We can make serious cuts in the defense budget. Mine are only about 10% greater than the Bowles-Simpson plan. And that we can look at some of these tax expenditures. Those are things like deductions and tax credits, again, mostly skewed toward wealthy Americans, and make some serious cuts there. By doing that, I'm able to achieve primary budget balance. That means we can have a balanced budget by 2015. Primary means we don't count the interest on the debt. And we can do it in a progressive way that doesn't hurt middle-income people.
How would you characterize the work of the commission per se as a member?
Well, first of all, let me just also point out that the Bowles-Simpson proposal achieves debt reduction by cutting 75% from spending and raising only 25% of the answer from revenue, which I think is exactly lopsided. The commission, even as we speak today, it's unclear to me how we get to a consensus where 14 out of 18 people actually vote for a proposal. I'm still a bit mystified on how this whole thing gels in just a couple more weeks, because pretty much everyone on the commission comes with a different point of view. I do think there are some things that we could agree on, and I think in general that the exercise has been constructive because, and I wanted to make the point as a progressive, that even progressives think, many, maybe Dean will argue against this, that down the road that the debt will be, could be unsustainable and that we ought to do something about it.
Dean?
Well, first off, I'm very glad to hear you have Representative Schakowsky, my mother's representative, on. I agree with most of what she said. Let me just make a couple points. First off, I think we have to be very clear about why we're in the situation we're in. And I know you introduced me saying I think the debt deficit should be larger. The point here is we're sitting in a context where we have 9.6% unemployment, 25 million people unemployed, underemployed, or giving up work altogether because we had the collapse of an $8 trillion housing bubble. And it's a little amazing to me that here we have a real crisis today People can't afford their homes, being thrown out on the street, can't raise their kids properly, and we're being told that if we don't do X, Y, and Z about the budget deficit, then 10, 15, 20 years down the road, something bad's going to happen. That's a little backward. These people are out of work not because they did anything wrong, but because people like Ben Bernanke, Alan Greenspan, Henry Paulson, you know the whole list, didn't know what they were doing. So people should be very, very upset about that. Now, getting down the road, it's actually, again, we've had an incredible misrepresentation. Everyone's around Washington saying how brave these people are. They've not been very honest, because you could very easily show, you go, okay, why are we looking at a situation where even when the economy gets back on its feet, we're looking at large deficits? Well, the answer is one word or two words, I guess: health care. We currently spend about twice as much per person as the average of other wealthy countries, Canada, Germany, England. We currently spend about twice as much. Those projections to go to 3 and 4 times as much, and we pay for most of our health care now through the public sector. If we don't fix health care, we have an enormous economic problem on our hand. GM's been in the news with its IPO. Well, one of the reasons GM went bankrupt is because it paid health care for its workers. That was an enormous disadvantage in the international economy. If we don't fix health care, we have an enormous problem in the private sector. We also will have very big budget deficits. On the other hand, and I have graphs, you can go right on our website and see them, if we had the same per person health care cost as, pick your country, Germany, Canada, Norway, whoever you want, we would not be looking at long-term budget deficits. We'd be looking at long-term budget surpluses. So we've seen a situation where the debate has been hijacked by people with an agenda to cut back benefits, Social Security and Medicare, other benefits that the middle class rely on. This is a middle class that has seen very little of the gains from economic growth over the last 3 decades, and they've totally misrepresented the situation so that they've now got a lot of support in the public that they're basically scared to death with misinformation.
I had read that you thought, in fact, what I said you said, which is the deficit could be larger.
Oh, no, I'm not disputing that. I just think it's important to understand the context. I'm saying we need to stimulate the economy right now, and the story is that the private sector won't do it. I would be delighted if we had firms running out there investing and hiring people, but in the wake of the collapse of the housing bubble, they're not doing it. So the question is the public sector going to fill that gap, or are we going to tell 25 million people, too bad, we're not very smart running economic policy here in Washington? I don't think the latter answer is acceptable.
Why aren't these corporations investing in America?
They don't have demand. They don't see demand. It's a very simple story. What you had here was an incredible plunge in demand. When the housing bubble collapsed, we saw a fall off in residential construction on the order of $450 billion a year. You had the end of the boom. We had enormous overbuilding. No one in their right mind is going to start a development. We also had a bubble in non-residential real estate. It was followed by a year and a half the bubble in residential real estate. Result of that was we had enormous overbuilding in most major areas of non-residential, commercial, office space, hotels, enormous overbuilding. No one's going to build in those areas. Also, on top of that, people had $8 trillion in housing bubble wealth. Most of that has disappeared. We still have a way to go. The house prices are falling again. My expectations, they'll fall another 15 to 20%. What that's meant is the consumption that was being driven by that bubble wealth has fallen back. Now, in the absence of demand, businesses are not going to invest. You have enormous excess capacity in almost every sector of the economy. So that means there's a very limited amount that businesses are going to invest. I actually been kind of impressed how much investment we've seen. If you just look at the sectors, equipment and software, that's been growing at a double-digit rate. In fact, about 15% over the last 5 quarters. So given how much of a downturn we've seen in demand from the private sector, the extent to which investment has held up, I think, has been impressive.
Demand is the key word, and that's when people have money in their pockets to actually go out and spend. And right now in the Congress, we're having a debate, and the Republicans are saying that if we don't give tax breaks to the wealthiest Americans, we're going to stop the job creators. Well, of course, that's just backwards. What we need to be doing, as Dean said, is stimulating the economy so people actually have money where they can go out and buy things. And that is the reason that the corporations will start to invest and expand their businesses. The very same people who are worried about the deficit are talking about $700 billion worth of tax cuts, and they're not really in favor of extending unemployment insurance. That's a huge debate right now. One of the most stimulative things that we can do for the economy is extend unemployment insurance benefits so people have some money to go out that they surely will spend right away.
What's going to happen to extending unemployment benefits?
Well, we just had a vote on it in the House, what we call a suspension vote that takes 2/3, and we lost that vote. I think it would be really a shame for us to end this lame duck session without extending unemployment insurance. This is not just because of the millions of people that will lose those benefits and have no discernible source of income since they've lost their jobs, but we need it for our economy.
How would you create the demand? I mean, do we need another stimulus program in your judgment?
My judgment, absolutely.
And your judgment,
and Dean, I'm sure you agree.
No, I absolutely agree. And again, basically, stimulus is costless to us right now. Or the ordinary story, and of course there's some truth to this, the ordinary story is government's spending lots of money, it's pooling resources away from the private sector. If we were back in 06, 07 when the unemployment rate was 4.5%, 5%, that's largely true. So if we were go back to those years and say, okay, let's have a really big stimulus package, that would push up interest rates, it would cut business investment, that would slow private sector growth. You can't tell that story today. We have very low interest rates. If the government were to borrow and spend another $300, $400, $500 billion to boost the economy, you're very hard pressed to tell the story that somehow that's going to cut back investment in the private sector. We basically have this very big hole in the economy, and you could like government, you could hate it, it doesn't matter. Nothing else is going to fill the gap.
The other thing, Charlie, is when you look at the examples that they give of how they want to come, asking senior citizens to pay more out of pocket for their health care costs, with the assumption that they have to understand, that is, older Americans have to understand how expensive these choices are, and they have to make better choices about their health care, is absolutely insulting, and it's also really the wrong way to go. Older Americans are spending about 30% out of pocket for health care right now. That's about the amount of money they were spending when Medicare was first enacted in 1965. It's simply not feasible to say that we should be balancing the budget, cutting the debt by putting more burden on the backs of older Americans. The average retiree now makes about $18,000 a year total. That's with pension, private pensions, and that's with savings and investments, $18,000 a year. And those are the people who ought to pay for what Dean is right, the growing cost of health care. The problem with the Bowles-Simpson plan is it doesn't look at health care as a whole. We can't just look at the public sector and Medicare and Medicaid, or even military benefits or veterans benefits. We have to look at the private sector as well and curb those rising premiums and those rising costs.
So you want more what, regulation?
Well, we did a lot of that in our health care bill. The Accountable Accountable Care Act is projected by the Congressional Budget Office to save $1.2 trillion over the next two decades. And I think there are a number. I put a public option back on the table. I say that Medicare should negotiate with the pharmaceutical companies for lower drug prices, like the VA does. That would bring down the costs. But to say that we're going to take it out on the backs of the beneficiaries, I think is not only immoral, but I don't think that it's the best, it's not the best way to go. It means that we're just shifting costs rather than actually controlling those costs.
Do you